one more fact about me. I was telling random facts for those who were waiting for this to start. I am definitely a socially anxious person, and doing these kinds of performative acts definitely activates all of that. And knowing that the proceeds for this are going to support pro bono care helps me like push past that. Okay, so, oh, and in practicing this, my slides did crash once, so I'm preparing for that. Possibly the cause of Slido, but we're going to try to use Slido today for feedback. So if you can hop on slido.com, and then our code for the day is 24689753. And hopefully Slido will not crash the computer. Okay, so I won't spend a lot of time talking through all of my background and about me, but a little bit to know about me to frame up this presentation. I am a professor at the University of Utah, going back to the Slido slide for those of you who are trying to join still. And I moved to Salt Lake City in part to become a professor at the U, but I have been trained in dialectical behavior therapy and at the University of Washington, where I trained under the treatment developer, Marsha Linehan. And when I moved to Salt Lake City, there really wasn't a lot of people who were doing full DBT. And so I kept getting a lot of calls from people being like, hey, who's doing DBT in town? And everyone was full and I couldn't take any patients. And so I joined forces with Robin Lang and co-founded UCEBT. We did that in 2013 and have been conducting not just DBT therapy, but also anxiety and mood, trauma and assessment and testing therapy. So these are my two identities, and you'll find that DBT heavily informs a lot of my presentation today. Okay, so our first Slido poll. Hopefully this works. I want to know who all is here and who I'm connecting with today. You can check more than one option too. So if you're a student and want to also put your student of what, that is a possibility. Aren't we all students though? Students for life. Danielle, if you check out slido.com, then you can just enter the code even if the scan doesn't work. All right. Thank you, social work, for showing up. Nice. Clearly, psychiatry, we need to do some more outreach there. Perfect. Well, for those of you who can't get in, the presentation certainly doesn't depend on it. All right, so here's our agenda. And the agenda for today centers around a thesis that I think is really important, which is that perfect prevention of suicide is really not possible. So a lot of public health efforts have targeted a zero suicide policy, have tried to get us to zero suicide. And the reality is that we cannot control the outcomes of many of the people who are seeking to help. So as we're going through this talk, I want us to understand that as like a core founding principle. We're going to cover ethics, obviously, because you're getting your ethics CEOs. And we're really going to focus mostly on beneficence and non-maleficence and the respect for dignity and rights. We're also going to explore the function of self-injurious and suicidal behaviors. So a lot of times our assumption is that the function is to die, but there are many functions for self-injury. A few we'll be talking about things like feeling stressed, rejected, ashamed. And The most common one that we think of is that the person is worried that they'll hurt themselves and they need to be somewhere safe. But a lot of times we jump to this conclusion without fully exploring all of the functions. We're also going to go into the patterns of self-injury. So this is a graph of suicide risk from a paper by Craig Bryan, looking at suicide across about 40 days worth of time. And you can see that there are different patterns for these two different people, one a single attempter and one a multiple attempter. We're going to dive in a bit to intervention in the context of assessment. So for high-risk clients, we're going to talk about how we get crisis or intensive services going. For moderate risk clients, we're going to talk about crisis response planning. And for low-risk clients, we're going to talk about psychotherapy as usual. So getting your assessment aligned with your presentation or with your intervention is really important. And finally, many of you are here for liability purposes. So a lot of times we think about liability in the context of documentation, but documentation is really just the tip of the iceberg. So we also need consultation, informed consent, and a personal or organizational philosophy. So we'll talk about each of these things. So even though perfect prevention isn't possible, it is possible for you to feel confident that you've done your best. And that's the goal of this talk. Okay, so ethics first. We'll get those out of the way. It's like eating your vegetables. Okay, so a question for you to contemplate and type an answer to in Slido. Do people have the right to die? Two yeses already. Yeah. Any caveats? Feel to type in other thoughts. Yes, but, or yes, and. So, yeah, I love the ambivalence there. So there is a strong sense in this group that this is a right, that people have this right, and that in fact people have bodily autonomy and can do with that. So we're going to be wrestling with yes and, right? So we struggle, I think, with, is the person fully grasping the consequences? Yes, age. So at what age does a person develop bodily autonomy? They start out literally connected to other humans and then grow and develop and become more and more autonomous. Where and at what stage does that develop? So complicated, largely yes, but complicated. So when we're thinking about beneficence and non-maleficence, it's really not the assessment itself that's the problem. In fact, asking people about suicide doesn't increase risk. There's some evidence that it decreases risk. And so assess away. The struggle comes with our reaction and then the decisions we make about what will happen to the person. So a lot of time assessment leads to an immediate response of fear and a reaction like calling the police or making sure that the person goes to a psychiatric hospital or other things that may or may not work for the person. So we're going to need to think in our ethical decision-making about the multiple intersecting identities that the person has. This is the homepage of the Trans Lifeline, and you'll notice that they have a philosophy, right? The Trans Lifeline provides trans peer support to our community that has been divested from police since day one. We're run by and for trans people. So they have very explicit informed consent all over their webpage that in fact, they will not call the police under any circumstances. they view the risk of violence by police toward trans individuals as being a higher risk than the person taking their own life. And so when people make this phone call, they know what they're getting. And this is a really great example of what we'll talk about of having a personal or organizational philosophy. So continuing on with our thoughts about beneficence and non-maleficence, maleficence. So we have to weigh the beneficence to the client and the patient. So things like their autonomy of decision-making, respect for bodily autonomy, offering options, right? So giving them the option of higher levels of care rather than demanding it. Minimizing therapist control, trusting the wisdom of our patients, and holding hope for their future self. So even when a client is hopeless and struggling, you holding that belief for who they can become and who they will become in the future. We also have the challenge of weighing beneficence to their loved ones and to society. So respect for the feelings of those who love them, considering the possibility that the patient is perceiving their burdensomeness inaccurately. So as many of you know, perceived burdensomeness is one of the risk factors for suicide. And a lot of times when people are contemplating suicide, they will communicate that they believe the world would be better off without them. Their kids, their parents, their friends, their family would be better off without them. And when you actually survey friends, family, that's not their experience at all. And so checking the facts with them about that possibility that they're perceiving their burdensomeness incorrectly. Considering their current and future contributions, which is an incredible challenge, right? With people who are young, you're weighing the possibility that what they will do in the future will be incredibly beneficial to society. Certainly, this current generation gives me a lot of hope for the future. So weighing that in your ethical decision-making and holding hope for their future relationships. So when we look at the precipitating events for self-harm and suicide, they're often interpersonal. And when interpersonal struggles hit, a lot of times the person is feeling like, oh, I've let everyone down, or my relationships are failed, or my relationships will always fail. So helping them to hold hope for the relationships that they will build and strengthen. Okay. So the other ethical principle that I want to focus on is respect for people's rights and dignity. So psychologists respect the dignity and worth of all people and the rights of individuals to privacy, confidentiality, and self-determination. Also, psychologists are aware that special safeguards may be necessary to protect the rights and welfare of persons or communities whose vulnerabilities impair autonomous decision-making. So tricky when it comes to someone who is contemplating suicide. Where I've landed is essentially my philosophy when I'm talking to my patients is ultimately, I cannot control what you do with your body and life in any regard, not with regard to what you eat, when you sleep, whether you exercise or do other healthy things. I have no control over your body. And if I think you are going to end your life, I will do everything I can to try to stop you, right? I will use all of my powers of persuasion and all other strategies I can to try and be helpful. All right, so our ultimate goal of an ethical assessment is that we go from the assessment to a shared understanding of what's going on for the client. And from there to a collaboration and a collaborative approach to figuring out the next steps. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the function. An assessment goes so much more effectively if we're getting at the function of the behavior in order to enhance our communication. Okay, so in just a few words, why do people self-harm or attempt suicide? What are some of the reasons? Yeah, coping, hopelessness, pain, yes, relief from pain. So many different versions of pain on here. Distraction, right? So non-suicidal self-injury in particular often has a distraction function, a sense of control, to feel something. Yeah, many people describe a sense of being hopeless for so long that they've developed essentially a sense of emptiness, and they just want to feel something. That can happen in the case of trauma, which is another word that I see on there, where a person has inhibited their emotions so much that they are no longer able to access their emotions, ending their suffering. Yes, this is great. Okay, so all of these center around a theme of intense emotional suffering of some sort, whether it's intense in terms of expressed emotional suffering or intense in terms of really inhibited emotional suffering. And the risky behavior, whether it's self-harm, suicide, substance use, or other risky behaviors, functions as a solution. And for many people, they have a hard time wrapping their head around this, but risky behaviors often just quickly solve the problem more effectively than any of our skills will, at least more quickly. But it comes with all these downsides. So the solution itself becomes a problem. People have consequences like scarring that they don't want, or end up drunk texting someone or making other mistakes that they then really struggle to recover from. The other problem is that the long-term issues often aren't resolved. So if you're able to solve your problem quickly by going and cutting or engaging in some other risky behavior, then a lot of times you don't loop back to the person who maybe you needed to solve the problem with because your emotions got regulated quickly enough. Maybe you self-invalidate and say, oh, well, that's not, it was my fault. It's not on them. And so the intense emotional suffering continues. So this becomes a tricky cycle that we're hoping to break. Another way of looking at self-injurious behaviors is that the crisis emerges when the stressors outweigh the skills. So stressors like difficulty with friends, school, loneliness, pain, and then the skill set that you have to work with, distracting, engaging in risky behavior, isn't effective or powerful enough to solve the problem. I'm going to break this down into smaller pieces so you'll be able to see this in more detail. I know it's hard to see on the screen, but I got this from Janine Martin and Casey Pearson. And Casey and Janine developed this in the schools, and I gave this talk, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years ago, similar talk, and they said, hey, we have this great worksheet that we use with our students, and thankfully granted me permission to continue to use this. So this is a document that they call Say What You Mean to Say, and we use it in our clinic to really help us listen and ask what's going on. So let's break it down. A lot of times we think that people are saying, I want to die, or they think that they're saying, I want to die. But what they're really saying is something more complicated, more nuanced, and more important for us to really get to the core of. So loneliness and disconnection. This will be sent out to you at the end of the presentation. Fear and stress. So perhaps the person is completely overwhelmed, fearful, nervous, feeling hopeless or vulnerable. Shame and self-criticism. Oh, shame is such a painful emotion. When we're feeling it, it's so hard to imagine feeling good, relief, hopefulness again. Sometimes people are weary. I didn't see this one coming up as often on the word cloud, but just exhaustion, fatigue, burnout. A sense of powerlessness or lack of control. So feeling defeated or trapped or aimless. And finally, pain and sadness, right? One of the things we had most in our word cloud. So feeling down and need to be lifted up, consumed by grief. And of course, this last one. And sometimes this is exactly what people mean. They're worried that they might hurt themselves and they need to be somewhere safe. But one of the challenges that we face is that we often jump to this conclusion and say, okay, I'm worried, I'm scared for my liability, I'm scared for your life, let's get you somewhere safe. But we haven't explored all of the other possible functions. Okay, so now how do we look at the pattern to determine the best course of action? So what are some of your personal fears when assessing suicide risk? What are the fears that come to mind for you? Oh yeah, the person might not be truthful, your liability risk, missing the severity, missing. Oh yeah, that the answers might actually be so painful that you're having a hard time separating from them. What do you do next? All the responsibility. Yeah, if you miss something and your client could die, and it's painful to lose a client. And most of us will in our career. Oh, that the therapy relationship will be threatened. That's super important. We'll definitely talk more about that. Awkwardly focusing on the wrong thing. These are fantastic. Responsibility to the teen client's parents. So balancing, we'll talk a little bit more about teenagers along the way, but balancing the respect for the teen and the need for the parents to know, betraying trust of the teen client, overreacting and making it worse. Yeah, the honesty thing is so important. And the reality is that we don't know if our clients are ever honest with us. I mean, we can make pretty good guesses after a while, but that's definitely a challenge, not only in this, but in all of our work. Having your fear show during an assessment, that we will talk more about that as well. Okay. One of my primary worries is whether I'm missing the pattern. And this came in part because of a story that Marsha Linehan told about a time when a client called her and was distressed, and she was listening to the client and thought in her mind that the pattern that was happening was a pattern consistent with past non-suicidal self-injury. And really, the pattern that was occurring was the pattern that had occurred in the context of her past suicide attempt. And so this is a client that Marsha lost, and she went to several public speaking events and specifically talked about this, about the pattern and understanding the pattern as important, in part as her way of repairing for the loss of this client. So this is a graph of suicide risk over 30 days. So we have on our x-axis the days, and we have on our y-axis suicide risk from 0 to 10. So in our work, there are some people here at the bottom, right? Low risk, maybe a few spikes along the way as stressors happen, but generally they're super low. Then if you notice up at the top, we've got our super high risk person, right? So maybe this is a person who's early on in treatment and they just feel like they're at their absolute worst, that nothing could get better. And maybe a few little blips of hopefulness that bring them down, but they're pretty chronically high risk. Then we have another pattern, the low and then whoa, what happened? This is our fluctuating up and down pattern. And then finally, an escalating pattern. So it's not really actually much of my, I'm not really super worried about the top pattern because you know what that client is going through. You can see every day their risk is high, your assessment is ongoing, you get a sense that maybe you can move it downward, but probably also everyone in their life knows that they're at high risk. So you and the client know together what you're working on. Same with the low risk group. They're, when they're going through their difficult times, a lot of times you can say, okay, we got this. Maybe they're that way after having gone through treatment, or maybe they've just not been particularly high risk ever. So one of our difficult ones is what we might call the surprise crisis, or the suppressed risk. So this person, in the face of an intense crisis, might jump from super low risk to the top of the scale. And so checking in with clients if they've had this pattern in the past. Are they the type who, goes through really intense crises? Or are they the type of person who's overly suppressing their suicidality, right? They're so ashamed of suicidality or have had bad reactions from providers in the past. And so when you're asking them, they're suppressing. They're saying, no, it's not there. But really it's bubbling under the surface. This is our escalating crisis or increasing risk group. So escalating crisis, this might be someone who's like, for example, going through a divorce and, just every time a new document comes at them or a new, bit of information, or they have to do more legal work, that their crisis just goes. Or it may be that for other reasons, like, bipolar symptoms or other things going on, that their risk is just steadily increasing. And then finally, fluctuating risk. So fluctuating risk is pretty normal and not so worrisome when it's lower in this, scale. But if it's fluctuating risk with these high peaks, those are people that I tend to keep a close eye on and worry about quite a bit. So one of the things, if you're working with a client who has high risk of self-harm or suicide, we'll talk more about daily tracking as a way to keep tabs on these patterns to see what's going on with them. So then how do we, in addition to tracking, assess the pattern? For ongoing clients, I would recommend a functional analysis. And in DBT, the type of functional analysis that we do is called chain analysis. So I'll be talking about links in a chain. So usually when we're conducting a chain analysis, we start with the target behavior. So for example, this client was cutting on their arm with a knife. The links in the chain are things that preceded the target behavior, and they tend to fall in your typical CBT, profile. So emotions, thoughts, physiological responses, and behaviors. It's so important to assess these links because a lot of times you'll find out that a person really lacks words for their emotions. Or when they're talking about a thought, they'll share a thought that was actually an emotion. Or they won't know. They'll be like, I don't know what I was thinking. Or they have struggle tuning into their body and their physiological responses, things like their heart rate increasing or getting sweaty or having a headache. So in this case, the person had an experience of a fight with a partner. They experienced shame. They had the thought, I am the worst. They had an urge to escape, right? Life is so hard. I need out. And then they faced a work crisis and a headache. right? So a lot of stuff piling on over the course of a day. And one of the reasons that we do these chain analyses with ongoing patients is because we want the phone call from them at the point of the fight with the partner, not at the point where they're right on the brink of self-harm behaviors. So helping the client, this is what I call the insight tool of dialectical behavior therapy. It helps the client to develop insight into their patterns. We also assess the vulnerability factors. So these are early in the chain risks for vulnerability to self-harm, vulnerability to being in emotion mind, as we call it, overly emotional. Things like poor sleep, chronic workplace stress, poor eating habits, alcohol use. These are all of your basic self-care things. So if your vulnerability factors are high, the probability that you will then be vulnerable when these links happen are increased. And then finally, we look at the consequences, both positive and negative. So it helps to keep that kind of calm and confident approach to assessment if you aren't just assuming that the consequences are all bad. So asking what happened, in this case, the person experienced relief, their partner was worried and attended to them, the conflict stopped, but then they also had to cover the cut at work and they were worried about scarring, right? So both positive and negative consequences are in the mix. We also don't tend to, explicitly say, wow, your partner gave you attention for this and imply that there's attention-seeking behavior going on. Instead, we're letting the client discover if there are functions that are happening, like why is my partner not giving the attention that I feel I need earlier in this process, and how do I develop the skills to ask for that attention? With short-term clients or people who are doing an assessment only, having a battery of questions that you can go to understand their history of self-injurious thoughts and behaviors. So this can include some thoughts about the behavior itself. Is it thoughts, what we also call ideation or a behavior? People can also have non-suicidal self-injury ideation, so they can be thinking about or fantasizing about non-suicidal self-injury. Then you want to assess intent. So was it non-suicidal in nature? Did these past events, did they have zero intent to die? Ambivalent, right? A lot of people actually are somewhere in between. They, may feel mixed emotions, like I didn't really intend to die, but I wouldn't have minded if it had happened, or I was self-harming, but I was having thoughts about like, I wish I had never been born. So ambivalent self-harm is really common. And then there's sometimes definite intent. And if a person has a history of going for long times with no or low suicidality, and then they have a history of hitting these like really high intent circumstances, I'm going to pay attention to that person as possibly that surprise risk type of person. What are the common prompting cues? The events, emotions, thoughts, or physiology that happens before self-injury? And then what are the common outcomes for them? Are there times when they've needed medical intervention? What are the negative and positive consequences of self-injurious behaviors? Okay, so we're going to spend quite a long time in this section getting at the risk level and matching our intervention to that level of risk. Okay, so what are some important things to assess in order to establish a client's risk level? Access to means, coping skills or protective factors, prior attempts, outside support, yes on protective factors again. History, intent, plan, means, yes. Do they have a plan? Love the history. Support system. So people, how's their network? Intent and risk and rescue, right? Will they be found? Are they likely to go to a place where they can't be found? Are they taking action on the plan? Impulsivity, thank you. 2 impulsivities at once, that's fantastic. Their values, ooh, I don't think I have that on this slide, but that is so true, right? So what are their values? What are the things that that value sort of falls in their protective factors? Things that might stop them. You guys are fantastic. All right, a few more people are typing, so. How desensitized to ending life and pain? So one of the theories is that people develop an acquired capability of suicide by engaging in multiple self-injuries over time, and or living in a working in a profession where you end up sort of chronically exposed to death or injury. Good, this is all fantastic. Okay. So in order to figure out what to do, you're going to need to establish the level of risk. And so I'm going to cover a lot of the things that you all brought up to start the conversation. This gets at the some of the thoughts that you all were having earlier about like, oh, will I be awkward? What if I say the wrong thing? What if I misstep? These are some phrases and concepts to really help you, have the conversation. And when I'm training graduate students, a lot of times I have an assignment where they need to go and do like a risk assessment with their cat or their dog, or their fish or their friend. Go and practice just saying suicide over and over again so that you can be calm and confident in the face of saying these things with a client. One thing we know is that clients can tell when you're saying things like, well, so maybe did you ever kind of, you probably didn't ever have the thought of suicide, right? Right. That sort of approach is automatically going to get you discomfort and lack of honesty. Okay, so each of these I have grouped as a set of principles with some suggested phrases just to give you ideas. Of course, use your own. So be genuine. This is really important because people can tell when you're not being yourself. Okay, so this might be like letting them know, here are my greatest concerns, right? You have a history of impulsively engaging in self-harm. You were just at the hospital for self-injury, and now you want to go out by yourself into the remote wilderness without cell phone access. So I'm pretty concerned that that might be not a good choice. This might be a suicide attempt, right? So just being honest about what you're worried about. Being collaborative, so saying things like, let's figure this out together. Be real about potential hospitalization. So things like, if I think you're going to die, I will take every step I can to convince you not to. And many people actually find it helpful to go to the hospital. So being real about what might be helpful about it. You would get a really thorough assessment. They would do a medication evaluation. They might be able to help with your complex medical condition and the combined depression, right? Like there are things that could be a real benefit. Also be real about what might not be fun, right? They're going to take away your shoelaces. If you don't go in of your own accord, it's, going to feel really a lot worse. Just talking through all of it. Respect autonomy. So in my case, I've definitely made sure to not, do the certification to be able to hospitalize people myself. And most of us don't have that certification. And so I will just lay it out there, right? Like I can't, commit you involuntarily. So This is going to be a decision that we make together. Do not make promises to keep secrets. This is especially true with adolescent clients. So I respect your privacy, and my most important job is to keep you safe. So a lot of times when teens say, like, right first thing out of their mouth is, don't tell my parents this. I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to listen, but I can't make that promise. And they know, like, that was part of informed consent at the beginning. But also, you know, hopefully over time you build up trust that you're not like turning to the parents for every single thing. Someone raised, I'm afraid I'm going to look scared, right? So the don't freak out principle. Even if you're brand new, you know, first time talking about this as a student, you now, having attended this talk, have heard these things before. You've heard it all, and you're here to help. So making the client not feel like they're somehow the scariest or most you know, dangerous client that you've ever worked with. And then validate the emotion and emphasize a different pathway to relief. So a lot of times we get stuck because we feel like we can't validate anything, but the emotion behind this urge to self-harm or suicide is valid, right? So it sounds like you're in so much pain. Let's find another solution. So you can validate it and be pointing in a different direction as far as the behavior. Identify the events that prompted the crisis. Just help me understand what happened. How do we get here? What's going on? Listen carefully and summarize the problem situation. So it sounds like X happened and then Y. This can be tricky if, like, for example, you're part of the problem situation, right? So then you're summarizing it back and you're like, it sounds like when my office didn't return your call, then you had the thought that I don't care about you. That would be so hard, right? So like just non-judgmentally looking at the problem and how they were coping with it. Helping them to generate a more skillful plan of action. What's worked in the past? What if we tried ... What's worked in the past can be a scary question. And every time I give this talk, you know, to my doctoral students, they're like, what if they say nothing, right? And that can happen, right? So a client is just at, you know, a complete level of distress. They might say nothing has helped in the past. And in that case, a lot of times I'll pull up my thick book of DBT skills and be like, whew, good thing we've got like 300 skills in here that we can figure out together. You know, so just giving them some hope that we're going to try lots and lots of different things. Emphatically telling them not to commit suicide or self-harm. This also is sometimes scary for people, but being really honest and saying something along the lines of, I care about you and you must not die. Even a person who I've just met, it only takes a few minutes of conversation with another person to be like, no, I really like this person. I really want them not to die. So you can say things like, I know I just met you and I really care about you. I don't want you to commit suicide. Generating hope. So a lot of times I talk about, you know, getting at that point of being on the brink of suicide as a stuck place. So a lot of times when a person is stuck, I imagine it like being in a corner of a building and all you have is a wall on one side and a wall on the other side. And it feels like either way you turn, there's no good solution. But our role as therapists is to help the client reorient out of the corner and see all of the room around them, all of the space in which they have to move. So helping a person get out of that panicked place of like, this is a rock and a hard place, I can't get out. So then, of course, you all raise this in your list of things that, you know, the questions that you need to ask. So, you know, getting at, it sounds like XYZ happened, and then you had the thought, or did you have the thought that suicide was a solution to this problem? or that self-harm was the solution to this problem. So ask about the behavior. Are they intending to do it? Okay, so what did you think you would do? Right? Is there a plan? Were you thinking about how you'd go through with the plan? So this can get at the access to means. It can also get at, are they planning to go somewhere where they won't be found or stopped or interrupted? Do you think you might go through with it? So what is the level of intent right now? What might prevent you from acting on that plan? So values, social support, protective factors, a sense of commitment, and we'll literally take anything and everything in this category. And I usually don't leave the assessment until I've helped to generate something to this question. My favorite story that I like to tell my students is that, I had a client where I just kind of kept pushing about like, what are your reasons for living? And finally, we got to the place where she admitted that she had just gone to Trader Joe's and she had bought a really cool seeming like vanilla cluster breakfast cereal. And she really wanted to try that cereal. I was like, good, we'll go with it. So anything can help be a barrier or a reason for living. So what specific reasons do you have for not committing suicide? So this can get into not only reasons for living. So I separate these two, even though I just kind of blended them there, because reasons for not dying are different from reasons for living. So a lot of times people will say, well, I couldn't do it to my family. Fine, good. I'm glad to hear that. And that's a reason for not dying. So I want to hear, is there something that is a reason for living? Like you have a commitment in the future. You have a soccer game that's scheduled for next Saturday and you don't want to let your teammates down. You are somewhat interested to find out, about some event in the future. You'd love to know what it feels like to graduate high school. So like finding something that the person wants to live for. So now that we have all these questions asked, how do we place them into kind of a category to help us figure out what is the next right move? So here are my personal definitions of when I think a person is at high risk. So the obvious, clear plan, means and intent, and few barriers or protective factors. Or similar circumstances and risk factors to past suicide attempts. Or their current distress is too high to assess appropriately. So every so often we get a client who's like sobbing uncontrollably and we can't get any questions asked. This is when I start going like, oh, we're perhaps at too high of a risk at this point. Or they're under the influence and they're, wandering around outside and you can't figure out where they're going or what they're doing. And you're having a hard time getting them to answer questions. So these are people who I'm going to be really mostly concerned about. At the moderate level, we have some degree of a plan, means and intent, and some barriers or protective factors, or somewhat similar circumstances and risk factors to past suicide attempts, or similar, situations like self-harm behaviors. But the person is able and willing to problem solve with you. They believe they wouldn't act, and they're able to make a commitment. So this is a fundamentally different level of risk, even if it feels very similar on the first two factors. And then our low risk person might have current ideation, self-harm or suicide ideation with no firm plan, an unrealistic plan, low intent, and there are barriers in place that would affect access to means. They're able and willing to problem solve and express an unlikeliness to act and are able to make a commitment. And finally, they're at least somewhat willing to try new or different things to alleviate distress. So then how do you match your intervention appropriately? For the high-risk client, we're going to be looking at crisis services. At the moderate risk, I recommend crisis response planning. I saw that in one of our, word clouds before. And at the low risk, we're working on skills and strategies typical to outpatient care. Okay, so let's talk about our high risk client. The high risk client, our goal has shifted from whatever else the person wanted to think or talk about to collaboratively working on safety. That's now the primary goal, because none of the other things can be solved if they are dead. We have to keep them alive in order to be able to solve the problem with mom, the problem with girlfriend, whatever the struggle is. This is where you want to involve the caregivers, if child or teen, or even young adults. So young adults, obviously, many of them are not, you don't have a release of information or other reasons to contact their parents. And so a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just say, let's call them together, right? Your parents care about you. They're probably worried about this. Let's figure this out together. And that can work really well if they have a reasonable relationship with their parents. Demystify inpatient treatment. So like I said before, this means talking about the good and the bad. I like to emphasize the benefits of voluntary treatment and the path in. So emergency rooms can be incredibly dehumanizing for a lot of our clients. It depends on the nature of the staff there that day, but it is a really tricky context. They come in and a lot of times they're searched, they go through a metal detector, their possessions are taken away, they're sent to a corner room, drug tested, given, a social worker on a computer screen, and sometimes in the middle of the night, then they wait and wait and wait until they finally can get a bed somewhere. And it's often not the bed that will be their final bed, but somewhere where they go for that night. If that particular emergency department isn't connected to a hospital, then they have an ambulance ride that takes them to, the next location. And that's not optional for most people. So there are other ways of getting into inpatient that are more effective. So going directly to the hospital and working with the assessment and intake team there is often so much better than going to the emergency department. We've also had patients who their emergency department questions were all like, so you're good now, right? They just really were trying to help the person, not get into inpatient care, but along the way, asking questions in such a leading way that it didn't foster honesty. So voluntary treatment and going through the most effective route is really important. And then offer crisis diversion options. Do they have parents or a partner who's able to commit to supervision? And this doesn't mean like removing the door to their room and watching them 24/7, but it does mean that the parent and the teen or the client and the partner are agreeing that the partner is going to do certain behaviors, lock up certain things, check in regularly, etc. And then work together, like calling and texting crisis services. So if a person shows to me that they know how to use crisis services and that they use them effectively, then that's going to lead me to be more inclined to keep them out of the hospital. For a moderate or fluctuating risk person, I like crisis response planning. So they need to have a distress level that's low enough to make a plan, or you put the plan in place early on. And a lot of times if I'm doing an intake for a high risk patient, in the intake, I will build a crisis response plan together. And I've gotten really positive feedback from that, where people will say, oh, I've like never left an initial assessment with some tools, and something helpful. So crisis response planning is fantastic. It's not designed for imminent risk. So it's really designed to be put in place when a person is like, a 7 out of 10 on their crisis scale or below. And again, for youth, caregiver collaboration is helpful. So a lot of times with the teen, I'll just be going through questions like, how could your parent help with this? What would be ineffective if your parent did this? I really want to know. So then when we bring the parent in, we can be like, hey, we have some suggestions for what we think would be super helpful and what the teen thinks would be not effective or not helpful. So here are the key elements of a crisis response plan. And usually we get 5 to 6 bullet points under each one, at least 3. So what are their triggers and warning signs? What are their existing coping skills? What are the things that reliably work, right? I'm going to call this particular friend, or I'm going to go on a walk, or I'm, going to, distract with my favorite television show. Who are your key people that you're going to call, including the crisis lines? So if they can't think of anyone, then you want to make sure you just go through all of the different crisis lines. Reasons for living, we've talked about this. What you do or don't want your parent to do, or a partner in the case of someone else who's living in the home. And what environmental safety factors can we take into consideration? So you always need to be asking, of course, are there weapons in the home? Is there a gun in the home? Where is the gun secured? For parents, a lot of them will really quickly say, oh, the gun's locked in a safe. And it's like pretty much every single teen that I talk to, they're like, yeah, I know the code. I was there when it was being programmed in, so I don't know why they think I don't know the code. Or we use the same PIN number for everything in our family, and I tried it and it worked. So I'm going to say whatever the code is, we need to change it and we need to make it not guessable. And for our low risk client, our goal is to establish hope and buy time through a mutual willingness to try anything and everything. So a lot of times we get clients who come to me and they say, I've tried everything and you're my last hope. And I'm like, well, that's not okay. Nope. I have a ton of skills, hundreds of them even, but if I run out, I will look for a colleague who has different skills. I'm definitely not the only one in town who can help you. I am not your last hope. Check your fear. So this came up earlier. Fear on your face often looks like disappointment or anger to a sensitive client. I talk to parents and caregivers about this too, because for example, if their teen discloses that they were sexually assaulted, a lot of times the reaction on the parent's face is fear, sadness, worry, anger at the fact that the world is such a difficult place. And what the kid sees is disappointment. I messed up. I'm a failure. Or you're angry at me. So working on this, videotaping yourself doing risk assessment, working on your fear, feeling like you are going into this with tools and techniques that keep you calm, so that you don't inadvertently communicate an emotion that you don't want to. So establish a commitment, and it's really important that this not be a contract. So I'm sure you all know this, given your answers to the questions above, you're so knowledgeable. And you should know that contracts have definitely, no suicide contracts have definitely not held up in court. So you don't want a person signing something that says, I promise not to commit suicide. Instead, what you want to be able to establish and document is that you have a commitment to working on this, that you have a commitment that they're going to show up to the next therapy session. You have a commitment that they're going to do their very best not to attempt suicide, that they'd call you first or call crisis services, right? Those are the types of commitments we want to be eliciting. You want to be listening constantly for risky behaviors and lack of skills, especially social isolation. validate the valid and established trust. And your goal for your low-risk client is to be able to say, I hear you, I understand you, and I have something for you. So you said to me that you wanted to get out of therapy a sense of being present and grounded, and that you wanted to be calm when in crisis, and that you hoped that you would be more effective in your relationships, and you wanted to feel in control of your emotions. So I've got skills for that. I'm going to teach you mindfulness, distress tolerance, interpersonal effectiveness, and emotion regulation skills. So what I did here is, in my initial sessions, I was listening for the exact specific struggles that would match with the treatment that I could provide, right? And each of you will have a different orientation and a different treatment, but connecting with the client on, here are your goals, and it's amazing, I have the exact set of strategies that you need to meet those goals. So once you've figured out what where the person is in your outpatient therapy context, reinforce and clarify your plan of action, elicit agreement that they won't engage in action for some period of time, right? So I usually start by saying, would it be possible for you not to attempt suicide for a year? Is that something you could do, right? A year would give us a lot of time. We could go through the whole set of skills twice. It would give you the data to figure out what you want to do with your life if we're making progress. What do you think? And then, of course, if the person says, yep, sure, right away, I will be like, really? That's a pretty big ask, so gently push back. On the other hand, if the person is like, no way, I don't think I can make it to tomorrow, I'm going to step it back. Well, what about 3 months? 3 months, I feel like I could get some good skills in, all the way down to, can we make it to next week? And if we can get our, to our 1 week, therapy recurrence, then that's enough of a commitment. It's scary, but it's enough. So getting that agreement. Agreement to remove lethal weapons. Troubleshooting factors, this is classic CBT, right? Troubleshooting factors that might interfere with the plan. So they form a plan with you, and then you say, well, what if this crisis happens? What if this exact same thing that made you suicidal before happens again this week? What's the plan? Figuring out how to increase social support. So a lot of times I'll have clients say, I'm in this new therapy, and it might be 6 or 8 months before I'm like really in a better place, but the first 3 months are the hardest. Like, could we make a plan for hanging out more, during these 3 months? Or, can we make a plan for how you'll check in and validate me while I'm going through the initial phases of this treatment? Support the client in talking with their partner, parents, supports, other key people in their lives. Helping those people to anticipate the recurrence of crisis. So I coach my clients to do this. Like, it's likely that during these first months that it'll look like I'm doing better, and then boom, it's just going to come back. That's a normal part of the treatment process. And sometimes I'll talk that through with the support network. You want to be exuding your calm demeanor with parent and teen in the case of teens, or with your client in the case of adults. Yeah, and if you've got a crisis plan that's credible, make sure you also, and a commitment that's credible, make sure you also provide resources for when the plan falls apart. The warm line up at HMHI is not a crisis line. It's open fewer hours, but it's there if you just need someone to check in with. right? So a lot of times people are like, I don't want them like hospitalizing me or thinking I'm in a crisis. And I'll actually pull up the HMHI website and I'll say, look at the header. The header says crisis diversion services. Like literally these are designed to divert you from going into the hospital. So don't wait until you're like at the point where you are, needing hospitalization. Call them sooner. Call the warm line when you know you have a hard, thing coming up that day. It's going to be a difficult day at work or, a test at school. The crisis lines, the crisis text line like 741, 741, and the Safe UT app are other great resources. And I do let people know that, yes, and it is on the HMHI website as well. So the Safe UT app and all of these will intervene if the person is at very high risk. So I just talked to them about, that's something that you want to know when you're talking to them, and maybe look at that say what you mean to say worksheet and use some of those phrases to help you to not end up in a situation where they think you're at imminent risk, unless you are at imminent risk, and then tell them. Practice using these resources together. So I'll actually do it in therapy session. One thing to know about the 741, 741 text line is they do collect data, and what you can do when you are on that text line is you can actually, and I think they tell you this when you get on, you can text the word loofah, and loofah will like scrub your data, so they won't use your data if you don't want it to be used. We're going to talk more about consultation. So consult. Plan your next contact with the person and take care of yourself. So on a difficult day of a risk assessment, that's a day when I make sure to go home and tell my husband that we're not going to watch a really like sad or depressing movie, right? It'll just like trigger too many of the same emotions that I was wrestling with during the day. Like that's the day for something lighter, something more distracting, not the day to solve like complex interpersonal struggles. That needs to be put on the Sunday agenda or some other day of the week. So really protecting yourself on days when you've had to do risk assessment. Okay, so for our clients with chronic or fluctuating risk, I also, if they're in long-term care, I want to monitor those fluctuations. So daily tracking is really helpful. So really want to emphasize the importance of monitoring fluctuations. The access code for the course evaluations should be in your email, but it might be in a different one from the Zoom link. So I'm sure Jen will let you know where that is. Also, just so you know, you don't have to answer every question perfectly to get credit, so do your best, but I always like struggle with that. Like, how much am I supposed to write? I'm not grading you. You'll be fine. Okay, so this third point I want to hit on really clearly. So emphasize the need for more intensive therapy. So there are layers of therapy, there are levels of care, and a lot of times a person just exceeds what you offer. They need multiple sessions a week, they need more intensive monitoring, and so just letting people know right from the outset that there are a lot of different types of care and the kind that you provide. And sometimes you might need more, right? Sometimes there might need to be someone who's doing weight monitoring and nutrition tracking. Sometimes it might mean that you need like 2 to 3 sessions a week. Sometimes you might need something higher level. And then keep teaching skills to help these clients with their fluctuating risk. Okay, the other thing that we're here for is liability management. And it looks like we're going to have hopefully a good chunk of time for Q&A. Okay, so question, can you state your personal or organizational philosophy, particularly on when to elevate care, confidently? Do you feel really confident that you know when you would say, this is beyond my capability level and we need to escalate level of care? So yeah, lots of people with yeses, but quite a few with no's and maybes. And I think this is actually quite common, that your organization doesn't have a clear philosophy, either that they're stating regularly in consultation team meetings, or using to guide decision making, or it's part of the consent documents or the contract that you're sharing with the client. So this is a key step for you being able to do all of the steps of liability management. So remember our iceberg, that your, yes, CAM's collaborative assessment and management of suicidality, I believe, that's in the chat. So definitely check that out, the CAM's assessment tool. So yeah, remember your liability pyramid, or iceberg, or whatever we want to call it. I guess an iceberg would go like the other way, where there'd be water. So you have your personal or organizational philosophy, and then informed consent. When people consult with me, the number one question I'm asking usually is, what does the client think you will do? What have you told the client that you will do? Do they have informed consent? Can you provide informed consent for this next step that you want to take in treatment? Consultation, so getting support, and then your documentation. So you've probably gathered that I believe strongly that documentation alone is insufficient for liability management. So thinking about your organizational philosophy or your personal philosophy, there's these two extremes. So on one extreme, we have the I refer out or hospitalize for almost any level of risk. That's probably quite a bit more extreme than any of us are. And same with the other end, right? Full client autonomy. I will never involve police or designated examiners. So those are people like who are able to pink sheet or white sheet or blue sheet a client to involuntarily hospitalize them. So these are at the extremes. And then figuring out where you or your organization falls between them is really important. And especially if you are part of a group, talking this through, because you may just be observing your peers constantly referring out, or bumping people to hospitalization pretty quickly and easily. And you may feel like, oh, my philosophy is a little different, but checking in, because you don't want to be so out of line with your group that then they're like, wait a second, you brought unnecessary risk into our team. So factors that can influence your organizational or personal philosophy include things like, are you able to see clients on a recurrence? So some people are in systems where patients just get scheduled in all over their schedule, and you don't actually have the ability to regularly see people every week or every month or some regular basis. So factor that into where you stand on that dimension. Are the clients involved with multiple modalities and or with multiple providers? So for example, DBT is an intensive outpatient program. And so DBT, the person is involved in group skills classes and in individual skills and in phone coaching. And so they're getting multiple points of contact a week with multiple different providers. Do the clients have access to phone or email? And do they know how to use those communication forms appropriately, right? So do they know to send a message saying something like, hey, I need to schedule an extra appointment, or I'm really struggling right now, can we talk by phone? As opposed to saying, it's midnight, I don't think I'm gonna make it, thank you, you've been great. That type of an email none of us want to get, and we want to be talking to people about how to use these forms of communication effectively and where the line is between communicating with us versus using crisis line. Are you tracking risk on a daily or weekly basis? If so, you have tons of data to help you understand, like, okay, this person has done this a lot. They bounce up to a 5 or a 6 or a 7 on the scale, but then they use skills and they come down and it didn't require hospitalization. Are you regularly consulting with others about risk levels? So, having a consultation team of some sort or a group of colleagues. And how have you provided informed consent about when and how you'll take action? So as you're developing your personal stance on these things, being able to address these questions can help you decide where you feel your risk and liability management will lie. So I operate from a DBT philosophy, and our philosophy is that clients are expected to use skills in their daily lives. Hospitalization is viewed as a last resort. So we're really, really focused on the client not bouncing back into the hospital because they then can't be practicing their daily life skills as effectively. And a lot of times they're avoiding important things that they need to be facing in their life. But of course, there are reasons for hospitalization even within a DBT philosophy. And some of our common reasons are like the client is spiraling rapidly or just on that steady worse and worse and worse trajectory. The client-therapist relationship is so ruptured that the client is unable to use skills. So if the client's gotten super angry or frustrated with the clinician, and every time the clinician is trying to coach effective behavior, they're like, you can't help me. That would be a time to potentially intervene with a higher level of care. Of course, the need for medical evaluation, like in the context of manic or psychotic symptoms, a severe eating disorder or substance use, having multiple eyes on this person could be really helpful. This is something that has always been a part of the DBT philosophy, and I've always really appreciated. Sometimes the therapist urgently needs a break or has a scheduled vacation, and the client is really spiraling and struggling and can't commit to staying safe for the time of the therapist's vacation. This can be a time for thoughtful and planned hospitalization. And then another reason it happens is that the client, the parent, the school, or the police decided upon hospitalization without consulting the DBT therapist. And, when this happens, of course, it's often really frustrating because we're like, I wouldn't have chosen right now to be the time to do this. Like this client was working on something in their daily life that was really important. And one thing I appreciated when I was training in Seattle is that the inpatient hospital would actually call me and be like, hey, I know you're a DBT therapist. Do you want this person to be hospitalized or would you prefer they be discharged? And that gave me the opportunity to be the hub of care for that person. So as far as informed consent in DBT, we make it really clear. Our goal is to keep you out of the hospital and in your daily life. And sometimes a higher level of care can be really helpful or even necessary. I'm not just going to do it randomly. So I had a telehealth client who was, spiraling in this risk. And I told him, hey, I'd really like to see you in person in the next session. And he said, no. I said, why? Like, we have a cool fish tank, got some new fish. I'd love to see you. He's like, I'm afraid that you're going to be like, nope, you need hospitalization. It turns out that was part of his learning history. That's what a provider had done to him before, is said like, whoa, need to see you in person. And then like, boom, immediately to inpatient care. So I just talked through like the informed consent for how I operate. And I was like, okay, what do you think would make me want to hospitalize you? Like, what could you or would you say if you in fact wanted to go to the hospital? And what do you think you're actually going to say, right? Like really sort of digging in and actually he didn't come the very next session, but he came the session after that. So we got him in. Okay, so consultation. Consultation serves multiple functions. It's a source of support. So relationship building and just feeling not alone. It offers alternative perspectives. So when we get stuck with our clients, we often get in this tug of war with them. And hearing alternate perspectives can help us to like let go of the rope and get on the same side with our patient, or just stop the tug of war. And then protection for you. So a consultation team has your back. They're a source of protection, and being able to document that you sought and received consultation is incredibly important for effective care. So let's talk through our documentation do's and don'ts. So, do. Refer in your note to your current and ongoing assessments. So what changed and what's similar to past times. Note the risk factors and the protective factors. I can't tell you how many times I've reviewed notes, either as a supervisor or in the case of legal cases, where none of the protective factors were listed. And that's so important for your ultimate decision-making about what you are going to recommend for the client. Make sure you're reporting on their resources, environmental safety, and sources of support. Describe their upcoming plans and next contact with mental health providers. So, client is planning to attend a family reunion and has therapy with me the next day. That makes it clear that you and the client have talked about what they're likely to do and when they're likely to see you next. Or if, for example, you're involved in medication or other type of role with a person, you document when their next therapy appointment is. Your behavioral exam, so noting things like, were they agitated? Were they hopeless? Were they irritable? Were they fluctuating in and out of awakeness and alertness? Paying attention to any behaviors that are, activating your spidey sense that this person is at some sort of deeper increased risk. What consultation you received, so who did you talk to? Or don't delay signing your note because you're like, I don't know who I'm going to talk to. Plan to receive consultation and get the note signed. And then most importantly, I would say, in light of all of the above, why you believe the current level of care is sufficient or not at this time. So being able to say that in light of these various risk and protective factors and the commitment to return to therapy next week, I believe that outpatient care is sufficient at this time, even though the client's risk has increased, right? So noting why you've made the decision that you've made. And then your don'ts. Don't describe everything that happened point by point. So this is not the opportunity for your, narrative story writing outlet. The problem with the blow-by-blow approach to documentation is that then at every point in the document, someone can potentially say, well, why did you do that? Why didn't you do that? Why did you make this decision at that time, right? So if you're doing the, client said this, I said this, client said that, it really just opens up a lot of places to ask, why didn't you do or say something different? Don't just say they're at increased risk without updating your assessment and saying what's going on or why they're at increased risk and what their, various protective factors are. Don't engage in multiple other forms of quote unquote documentation without completing your chart note. So other forms of documentation, are you texting back and forth with the client? Are you emailing back and forth with the client? If you're just kind of continuing to do this, but you haven't completed your chart note, that becomes the evidence trail of your decision making. I want to be really clear, it's actually quite hard to lose a lawsuit related to suicide. There are a lot of factors that will protect you in the case of legal action, but it's really stressful to go through. And so having your chart notes, pretty airtight will help you feel a lot more confident. So yeah, so if you're just engaging in other time-stamped communication forms, that becomes the paper trail. Don't wait for later to document these ones. So in my years of supervising, there's two types of late charters. There's the late charters who are just late across the board with everyone, and chart notes are awful. And so they're just kind of constantly like trying to dig out of the hole. The other kind is the type of person who avoids the hard ones. So they'll go in and quickly chart the people who, were super compliant, who did what they needed to do. And then they'll say, oh, I'll get to this one after dinner, or I'll do this one tomorrow because I need to think about it and I need to do a good job. And that one is much more worrisome. Then you are, sort of showing evidence that you could and were able to chart, and for whatever reason, you skipped this person. So approach the difficult cases and leave the easy ones. If you're getting behind, you want to prioritize getting a time-stamped document in place for the high-risk person. Many people are keeping chart notes in a non-time-stamped form, either paper or in a Word document or whatever. Make sure if you don't have an electronic medical record that timestamps everything, that you are in fact timestamping in some way the difficult cases. So sending yourself an email that says, wrote chart note at this time. Timestamps are important because you could, after the fact, go back and change what your note says. So let's say that you learn that your client has committed suicide. The urge to go back, right, and write some sort of an altered or different note may be there, and that will raise questions if you are in a lawsuit. Timestamps are really helpful for high-risk cases. And don't fire the client. I know this seems obvious, but we get a lot of people in DBT who got to us because they were fired for being really high risk. And you always want to create a path out for people. And our rule of thumb is about 4 sessions. So saying, you need a higher level of care. I need you to, work right now on getting on wait lists. We have 4 sessions for you to do that. The temptation is there, but try hard not to fire your client. Okay. Oh, I'm doing great on time. I'm so proud of myself. So never worry alone. This is our internal mantra that we use at our clinic. You want to form a network of colleagues who will help you. So these are people who will help you to know your philosophy. They'll help you to describe your approach clearly to clients and document their understanding. And they'll support you when deciding whether a higher level of care is needed. And so I just kind of give some examples here of escalating higher levels of care. So DBT is an intensive outpatient. It is often a recommendation for clients who aren't responding to once a week outpatient care. You might recommend another IOP, like an IOP for obsessive compulsive disorder, for example, if that's underlying and driving some of the issues. Then there's inpatient treatment, residential treatment, and at the highest level, state hospital, which will often take people for much longer, terms of care than residential. And then have your network of people support you in documenting consistently and effectively. So will they log on with you at 7 a.m. on every Tuesday, and just you'll get your coffee together and knock out all your chart notes. Having someone who can support you like that is fantastic. Okay, so we have lots of time for Q&A, you know, if you are lacking in consultation, feel free to reach out to me or check out our website. So hopefully we'll have some questions. And feel free at this point to drop them in the chat or you know, turn on your camera so I can see you and just shout it out. Monica, can you type or tell me a little bit more about what shoring up, what you mean by shoring up? Thank you, Brian.
Hi. So it was taught to me in the last several years, but I can't seem to find it when I try to Google it. But it's basically the concept of, you know, we don't want the client to move forward with self-harm, and we don't want them to, so it's like you can't move forward, you can't move back, you need to stay right where you are and just be safe. So it's kind of whatever that means to that client, if it's wrapping in a blanket and eating ice cream for the day or whatever, it's kind of like a harm reduction concept.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I think probably when the person used shoring up, that isn't like the exact heading of any of the DBT skills, and that's why the Google searches aren't going super effectively. But the things that you're describing fall under the broad header of the distress tolerance skills. And when we teach our clients distress tolerance skills, we teach that these are skills that will help them from making the problem worse. They don't really do much to help improve life, right? There's other skills for that, like mindfulness and emotion regulation and interpersonal effectiveness. These are just designed, like you said, to shore up or kind of keep things from getting worse. And so things like the stop skill, right? Just stop where you are, think, observe, proceed mindfully. You know, self-soothe skills like wrapping in a blanket or taking a bath or whatever. You know, and these skills aren't designed to be used to solve problems, right? You can't solve your problems with a bubble bath, but you can hopefully just stop from spiraling in a worse direction.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I'd check out the distress tolerance skills. All right. What other questions do we have? We have plenty of time. Thank you, Terry. Yes, I will be sharing with these slides. You'll see the say what you mean to say. So you'll be getting those. Okay, here's a question. How involved should emergency contacts be? Should therapist and emergency contact be in communication, like an ROI signed, or what is the role of the emergency contact? Yeah, that's a great question. So I found that it really varies from person to person how much they'll want the emergency contact to be involved. And it really is wise, like you said, to get an ROI in advance and to talk with them when they're in a more grounded, calm place about what do you want me to say or not say. Technically, in the context of an urgent crisis emergency, you can decide to break confidentiality, like you can weigh the risks as higher than the need for the ROI. And I really, really hate to do that. Like it would need to be pretty much imminent for me to decide to do that. So getting a clear conversation with the client in advance, and then also with the emergency contact. Are they, are they willing to serve in this role? Because a lot of times people will think they understand what that role might be. And I'm like, this could be like the person is standing on a bridge, right? Like, do you want that level of responsibility? What if your phone's turned off? What are your concerns? So getting as many bits of informed consent done as possible. And yeah, like I said, to answer the first part of your question, it just really depends a lot. It varies person to person. Okay. Oh gosh. So Josh asks, how do you navigate a patient who needs a higher level of care due to increasing risk? But the real world gets in the way, right? The insurance, the wait list, finances. Yeah, I really dislike the real world. I prefer not to be in it a lot of the time. I think that in this case, I am trying to have a really clear, ongoing, informed consent with the person where I'm saying to them, this is really outside of my specialization. I really do feel that you need this support. Hopefully you'll be at the top of the wait list soon. I also reach out and call my colleagues and say, this is a person who really needs to get into your service, and about how far down on your wait list are they. So I'll try and do some advocacy. The important thing is, if possible, to not abandon the client. That creates a lot more liability. And so that may mean that you're extending a bit beyond the 4 sessions if they're quite high risk. And that's not easy for any of us. So I wish I had better answers for that one. Thoughts about incorporating telehealth into suicide assessment and interventions. So I think all of us got pretty surprised by how much more effective telehealth was than we thought it was going to be. I know I had my own fears and worries about how telehealth would go, and many of them were, they were assuaged, I guess, so to speak, by the circumstances of COVID. And, and still there's that, that little bit of information that you can get from seeing a person in person for suicide risk assessment. So things like, is their leg bouncing, right? You can't see that super well over the screen, but it's a sign that the person's anxious or agitated or really struggling in that moment. Wringing hands, other things that just fall below the camera level. And so a lot of times I'll have to incorporate those as specific questions. Like, I can't see you. What's going on with your body right now? Are you tense? Are you twisted up? Are you wringing your hands? Are you, hyperventilating or sweating, or something that I can't tell very well over the camera? And encouraging them, if they're high risk, I like to be seeing them in person more often than not. But consistency, including if that means you have to do telehealth, is probably more important than having them in person. Feel free, if I'm not answering your question fully, everyone, just feel free to type in more. Okay, so Leslie, do you have any specific recommendations for schools related to when to refer for higher levels of care? There is a care shortage and a therapist shortage for adolescents and adults. And yeah, medium and high risk kids who can't get services right now. This is really true. We are in a huge deficit of providers to those who need care. So for schools, I would say that first of all, if there is a therapist involved, we really like to hear from you. Like, we really love it when we get an email or a phone call and you say, like, I've got an ROI to talk to you about this person. Let's connect. Because sometimes we're at odds with one another without realizing it. Like, we're trying to shore up some strategy, and another set of circumstances at the school means that, oh, that team can't practice that strategy there. So that connection is really important. It also means that when you're in a place of like, oh my gosh, this kid really needs care, you've got got a relationship with all of us and we're hearing from you. And so, then you can call the desk and be like, hey, this person's on your wait list, like really worried about them. So doing some of those ways of connecting. And then let's see, what other things do I feel are really important for schools? Yeah, so ideally not hospitalizing without talking to the therapist, but hospitalization is a route, sadly, for a person into care, because then you get the amazing social workers on the unit who are working on doing that, making the phone calls and trying to find someone who has an opening and working with insurance. So yeah, I would definitely say that is unfortunately a route in some cases, and doing everything you can in that case to tell the adolescent what to expect, because some of them, that I've worked with will tell me horror stories years later, and it's because they didn't know what they were getting into. They thought it would feel better or safer or less scary, and it was really overwhelming for them. So those are some of my initial thoughts. Okay. So this one came to me directly, emphasizing Marsha Linehan's treatment objective for clients, which Marsha talks about creating a life worth living. So when I also find this really helpful when we're working on developing therapy goals with the client. We talk about like what would make your life worth living? Like, what is the life that you want to wake up and be in? Help us like use that to shape your therapy goals. And then also it can be a really nice way to, when they come in and they're really frustrated about something, just being able to say, it sounds like that's not part of your life worth living. And it can be incredibly validating to the person, like, yeah, what happened at that family Thanksgiving was definitely not in my life worth living goals. Let's see, 2 questions. Do you have any modifications you make for telehealth? Yes, making sure you have the client's address before session. What if they're having a session in their parked car, better than their driving car? And what procedures for a client who drops out of therapy prematurely when you are working on these collaborative goals? Okay, so let's start with the first one. Definitely, we have their address. When we send the telehealth link, we have a statement that you must be in Utah or in a state where your therapist is licensed to practice, because clients don't understand this because our licensure laws are ridiculous about this. They're like, it's over, Zoom or whatever, not Zoom for us, but whatever your telehealth system is. And they're like, I can be in, Nebraska, no big deal. But really it is a big deal because of our licensure laws. So we have to really orient people to, don't do this, let me know. Luckily for psychologists, we now have PsyPact, so we're able to practice across a lot of different states. Hopefully that will be true for many of you and your licenses. We make sure we have their address, ideally an emergency contact. And then I usually do an orientation on that first session where I'm like, okay, so please don't try and do therapy from your car. Definitely not while driving, because then I'm going to spend the whole session worried about whether you're going to get in a car accident while you're on the phone with me, and I won't be effective as a therapist. Also try to have your snacks beforehand, because there's nothing more distracting to a therapy session than hearing you crunch on your Takis the whole time. So, if you can get the snacking done beforehand. So I try and do like an orientation. I get mildly dizzy if someone's on their cell phone and it's going like, ooh, and their face is all over the place. And that also lowers my effectiveness as a therapist. So at the very least, if you can get a stand or some way to prop your phone up if you don't have a larger device to join from. When a client drops out of therapy prematurely, that is so sad and so frustrating. In DBT, we talk about the therapist's skill of pining. which essentially means that we will try and reach out and say like, oh, I really miss you. I really want to keep working together. Will you please schedule again? From a liability perspective, though, you document, right? Client dropped out, and you archive that chart as quickly as you can, because then you're essentially showing that it wasn't like that you were just sitting there with an open case with high risk, and you weren't, ignoring their risk and you didn't fire them, like they made the choice to drop out of therapy. ROI, yes, release of information and not silly. All the abbreviations in our field will drive any of us nuts. Thoughts on the best assessment to use in order to analyze suicide risk in congregate care settings? Ooh, I work in a homeless shelter without an on-site clinician. This is amazing, Annie. This is such hard work. I have to say, I don't have this experience personally, and now I'm feeling like I'd love to learn more about this. The assessment principles feel similar. Can you try and understand what a person is going through and what are the risk factors and what are the protective factors? But then the what to do next, I think, is a lot harder, especially if the population is transient and you're not sure if they're going to be back the next night. And then also, if you don't have an on-site clinician, that's a lot for you to hold and a lot of liability. I think this comes back, my gut says that this comes back to your organizational philosophy. So talking with other people within your organization and figuring out how much do they want you to know and ask versus do they just want you to hand out a resource sheet and be like, here you go. That's what I would recommend, at least at this point, with knowing that. My eyes just jumped down a bit to Bobby's question of why not sitting in the car. I do have some clients that do therapy in the car. It's their most confidential and private space. It's often not the best for a variety of reasons, like the temperature in Utah is never the right temperature for sitting in your car. And so you end up like for 45, 50 minutes with like the car running and just idling. So that's certainly not ideal, but if this is what they have as their best space, then I'll just talk it through and be really clear about make sure your phone's not jiggling all over the place and make sure you don't drive and that you park somewhere with good signal. Okay, so Jen, which DBT skills have you found most helpful for clients engaging in self-harm? So all the skills are helpful. The question is the matching. So I've rank ordered. I have a rank ordered list of all the skills from highest to lowest distress. And then it's like, okay, if the person is, we usually ask people when they call for skills coaching, like, what is your SUDS? So SUDS stands for subjective units of distress. A 0 is like, super low. 10 is super high. And like anything that's like an 8, 9, 10, I'm going to use skills to just like bring the temperature down, and then there's a whole bunch of skills that fit in the middle range, like, using interpersonal effectiveness or acting opposite to your emotion. And only if a person is at a pretty low distress level will I be like, this is a great time for mindfulness or doing a pros and cons, or reflecting on your wise mind. So like different DBT skills or whatever your therapy skill set is for different crisis levels. All right, we're almost out of time, but Annie mentioned the CSSRS, which is the Columbia, right? The Columbia Suicide Risk Scale. Yeah, okay. So the Columbia is a great measure. It's commonly used, so put that in your toolkit. I also often use Marsha Linehan's LSASI, which is the Lifetime Suicide Self-Injury Scale Inventory. Yeah, so the LSASI is another way to just go through self-injury history. Let's see. What do you do if a client's situation is really helpless? For example, the client has a terminal illness and there's nothing that can be done even to minimize the pain or other symptoms. Yeah, we've all had clients that just we could not imagine where we would find the hope for that client and their circumstance. A lot of times I'll rely upon my consultation team and be like, I've fallen in the pool, right? Like I need you all to throw the life preserver because I'm in the pool with the client. Like I'm feeling as hopeless as they are. And let's be clear, life is full of really hard, really hopeless situations, ones that would test any of our limits. A lot of times I'll just talk to clients about that. Like, this is really, really hard, right? Like what you're going through is incredibly difficult, incredibly valid. And how can we help you to find your effectiveness even in the context of an incredibly difficult situation? And some of that may be figuring out what acceptance needs to happen. And acceptance doesn't mean approval, right? It doesn't mean you're like, cool, this is a great life circumstance. It just means that you stop fighting it, stop battling against it, and acknowledge that you have, for example, a terminal illness. And what does that mean? And what is your values-based way of going through this terminal illness? I'm sure we could have a whole separate conversation for like 2 hours on this topic. So great question. Recommendations for excellent DBT skills training. So we're going to definitely start putting some of those together here. But the gold standard skills training that's out there for DBT can be acquired from behavioral tech. So behavioral tech is Marsha Linehan's company, and there are like various introductory level classes like skills. Yeah, thank you, Sheila. There's all the way up to intensive level training. So our therapists all have intensive level training that's 5 days, then 6 months of self-study, then another 5 full days, and then you pass a bunch of tests, and then you're a DBT therapist, assuming you then like deliver the full program. So there's everything from skills all the way to intensive training, and then DBT certification is no higher level than intensive training, but it involves getting a certificate and paying a ton of money. So some people decide they want that certification. I personally haven't found that extra shelling out of cash to be particularly helpful. Yeah, PsychWire is good. And yeah, Bethany, for the access code, if you reply to the email that sent it, they'll make sure you have it, but it's not the meeting passcode for the Zoom link. So you all have been absolutely wonderful, and I loved all of these questions. And just tell your friends this is going to be free and available on YouTube if they want to watch it. And of course, you all will get the recording and my slides. So thank you. Yeah, have a good Friday.